Hello, everybody, and welcome to this next session. We're just letting people in, letting you connect to audio. I recognize some of the pictures, so we've got repeat customers coming in, so you know the drill by now. But welcome to this session. This is navigating the barriers to trusteeship. This is part of our aspiring trustee strand, but of course, if you're out there doing recruitment for your board, then this will be pertinent to you because these are the barriers that your potential trustees will face. So welcome to the session. Just to run through the housekeeping again, in case there are any first timers here. The session is being recorded. You'll receive a copy of the recording later on. And if you're a weekly pass holder, you'll get them all by the end of the week. Please do stay muted on the call unless you've been asked to unmute. It just makes it easier for everybody to hear what's going on and also to chair and manage such a big group. Closed captions are available. You just need to enable them from your end. Please do use the chat function to ask questions and share experiences. We do love hearing from you. And please also feel free to ignore the chat if that's better for you. We've found that the audience is sort of split down too on this. So if you want to talk to us, you can do it. If you don't want to, that's fine. Just listen instead. If you do ask a question, we'll read them out fully in the chat. Will be included in the recording too, so you can catch up on all the links that people are sharing. Just to say that straight after this session in this room, we will be doing our networking for Wednesdays. So if you're here for that, you don't need to leave this Zoom call. Just stay on this Zoom call, and it will switch over. Thank you to our media partner, Third Sector, for all the noise they've been making about the festival. And lastly, to Ecclesiastical, our sponsors, who have meant that all of the sessions in this Aspiring Trustee strand have been made available free of charge. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Satna.
Hello, everybody, and welcome tonight. I'm just going to get my slides up on screen first. Okay. Can everyone see that now? Yep, perfect. Thank you, everyone. So welcome along tonight. So just in case you're in the wrong place, tonight this is a webinar and Q&A session on It's Not in Your Head, Navigating the Barriers to Trusteeship. So you'll be hearing a little bit from me, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of a chat together at the end. So my name's Sapna. I'm a lawyer by background, but I now work as a consultant, and I have multiple board positions across different types of organizations. I'm also an associate for Getting on Board. So I do things like train on the Charter Board Leadership Programme, and I coach aspiring trustees and help them through their journey into getting positions. So if you've been in one of my sessions before, you'll know that I love a bit of Menti and some interactive elements. So if you can, please get logged on to the Menti tonight. For anybody who hasn't used it before, you can scan the QR code or the web code. You don't need to register for anything. You just need to pop in that code. And once you're on there, if you could tick the little thumbs up in the corner to let me know that you've found your way onto the platform, that would be great. It's often helpful to do it on a second device. So if you're on your computer and you want to use your phone, that can be really helpful. Great, I can see you all getting on board now. And you will take from that you'll be joining me in some of the work tonight, and it won't be, you won't get to sit back and listen on this one. So today we're going to be covering what are the barriers to trusteeship, what can you do to navigate them, and what can you do to make sure that others don't have to? So, first of all, I wanted to ask a bit about everyone in the room. So, have you experienced barriers in your journey to trusteeship? And I've given a few different options there. So, no, I'm here to learn about the barriers that other people experience. No, I haven't started that journey yet, so I just haven't had the opportunity. Not sure. Yes, tried and haven't been able to find the right position, or yes, I've tried and I'm experiencing barriers in my current position. Okay, looks like we've got quite a mix in the room, which is fantastic. A lot of people not sure as well, which I think is really typical, that actually sometimes things don't feel right, but we don't always have the language to name it, to understand what's going on. And we don't always know if it is a barrier or if that's what's normal. And I think that's particularly true really in the early stages of your trustee journey, that you don't know what normal is. So you don't know whether what you're experiencing is a barrier or just you getting familiar with an unfamiliar environment. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, everyone. That's really helpful. So we've got a quote to kick us off from our very own Penny. This is from a blog that Penny wrote. Given that 2/3 of trustees are aged over 50, 92% are white, 60% hold professional qualification, 2/3 are male, and 3/4 are from households above the national median for household income, are you telling me that all useful trustee skills, knowledge, and experience exist among older, white, wealthier, straight, able-bodied professional blokes? And I think this really cuts to one of the really key critical issues and that really common question that we come up against when we're talking about diversifying boards around, are we going to have to compromise? Are we going to have to compromise on quality? Are we going to have to compromise on experience? And, this is the flip side of that question. This is actually, if you're saying that, we're worried about that, the flip side is that you're saying actually you think that talent exists to a greater degree in those groups that are overrepresented on boards. And that's a really difficult conversation sometimes to have around. Actually, it can be quite a bit more challenging, I think, when people don't realize where that question hits a nerve with certain people. And it's because actually the flip side of, well, are we going to have to compromise, says we don't recognize that talent is equally distributed and opportunity is not. And therefore, actually, when you're questioning the talent rather than the opportunity, you're hitting on those systemic issues, those systemic barriers and systemic inequities that exist. So here's another piece of evidence, and this is from some research that Reach did. And it shows that the diversity of people applying for trustee positions through Reach's service are considerably more diverse than the trustees being appointed. And again, this is to back up that actually there are barriers in the system. The barriers exist. If we had a fair system, we would have fair outcomes. We would have equitable outcomes. And that just isn't the case at the moment. We don't have equitable outcomes. We don't have that equality. And you could say, I think lots of people like to talk about how, well, actually those, there are other systemic barriers that those people face as well. And that's true. But it's also true that how we measure, how we set our requirements for who can and can't be a trustee also exacerbate those barriers, exacerbate those inequalities. And we need to take responsibility ourselves for undoing that. So I wanted to talk a bit about what are the barriers to trusteeship. So my first question for you is, at what stage do you think aspiring trustees encounter barriers? Okay, we've got a pretty even split. And if you didn't notice, you could pick more than one option. Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. All of them. Absolutely. And we saw that split, that really you can encounter barriers at any stage in the process. And I mentioned at the beginning that actually being able to identify and articulate that barrier exists is a really critical skill in then being able to navigate it. And I think a big part of what we encounter at the moment is that lack of language and that lack of sort of a mechanism for identifying, for saying, this is what's going on and this is what I need. So I want to spend a bit of time as a group talking about the barriers that you might encounter at each stage. And again, I'm going to ask you to come up with what you think can be a barrier. So what do you think can be a barrier at the search stage? So when somebody's, first of all, looking, so what are the barriers you've experienced or that you anticipate that somebody else might experience when it comes to looking for a position? So one of the big ones that we talk about at Getting on Board is that only about 10% of those vacancies are actually ever advertised. So if you're not already in the club, you're only seeing a really, really small proportion of the opportunities that are out there. And there are 90,000 opportunities out there. So that's a huge barrier, that lack of open recruitment. Yeah. And language has come up a lot. Yeah, we know that often there's biased gendered language used, or there's just inaccessible language used. We use a lot of jargon. I worked in the higher education sector for a really long time, and it's an awful sector for just making up job titles that mean nothing to anyone outside of the sector. And I remember going in and when I took charge of the legal team, and I was like, I want to change everyone's titles because nobody outside of this organization would understand that those people are doing legal work. You've used a title that somebody in the legal field would think of them as project managers. And so language is incredibly important, knowing the right job titles, knowing the criteria. Again, some of the work I've done in other organizations, we've moved completely to skills-based criteria. So there is no qualification requirements. There's no unnecessary requirements for sort of educational attainment. It's about, do you have the skills for the job? Closed networks. Yes, you need to already be in the club to get in the club, which is just circular. We all end up hiring our friends. Imposter syndrome, yes. And if you are not already signed up to Friday's session on imposter syndrome, please do come along to that. Okay. Next, what about during the application process? Yep, selector bias. They're not picking candidates that are like them. We all are attracted to people who remind us of ourselves. And are we doing enough? Not a long enough deadline is a massive one. People, you see there's a 2-week deadline. The reality is, there have been times where you don't see it until a couple of days before the LinkedIn advert comes in. And it closes too quickly. They've not left it open for long enough. Yep. No application used. So I'm guessing that means, there's no sort of system, even or that it's an inaccessible system. When people want something really bespoke for that position, so it takes a lot longer. You can't just put in your standard covering letter and CV. They don't want that. They want something really bespoke. Again, that takes a lot more time. It can be really tricky. Yeah, and expectations that it's got to be done in a particular way. Again, we're not always, as a sector, particularly forgiving when people don't get it done in the right way. And a big part of what we do on the Charity Board Leadership Programme and other elements of the activity at Getting on Board is about helping people learn more about that. But ultimately, it isn't something that everybody knows about. And yep, Kevin, conscious bias as well as unconscious bias is absolutely. If I'm honest, I've stopped using the term unconscious bias and I tend to just use the term bias, because the reality is it's on a spectrum. At a certain point, you've been made aware of it and it stops being unconscious anymore. And you've really got to take on that responsibility for taking it out of the process. And, very few of us have not now done a bit of unconscious bias training. Okay, what about the interview? I remember once, it was one of those, I applied for a job where the interview had been set in advance, and they'd said, right, so they came out and they said, this is the date for it. And I went back to them and it was a day that I could not make. And could they move it? They were like, no, we've spoken to all the panel. This is the only day we can do that month. And I just had to withdraw from the process. So being really inflexible, making it in person. Yep. Having trouble responding because of your previous experience when they require it. Yep. The timing of it, it happens to be on a day where you've got childcare responsibilities or other caring responsibilities or some other commitment. Yeah, people behave differently in interview situations. One of the things, again, that we talk about in CBLP, and I think is quite particular to trustee positions, is when they tell you it's an informal chat and it's not an informal chat. I think that is particularly the case in this trustee environment, where we just pretend everything's super casual, super informal, but actually you get there and then there's three people across you on the other side of the table, and you're going, oh my gosh, and they suddenly go into interview mode and just start asking tell me about a time when, and your heart sinks a bit because you haven't prepared for that. We can be really bad at that. Not part of the network. And, I think there are a lot of organizations now where you feel like your time's being wasted because the reality was they were never going to take a candidate that wasn't part of their standard anyway. But what they needed to be able to do was demonstrate that they had a diverse shortlist. And, over time you get better at weeding those ones out. But you can waste a lot of time in that process. Yeah. What about when you get at the offer stage, when they're offering it to someone? And think about if you're the person who did get it, but also if you're the person who didn't. I think a really common thing we hear for candidates who are struggling to get a position is the lack of feedback. Yep. How do I get better? Nobody tells me what I did or didn't do well and why I didn't make the cut. Yeah. Also, again, unrealistic expectations. Sometimes it's here, yes, please come on board and can you attend the meeting next week? Well, that's not a reality. And it's in central London and you've got to travel, and all those things. Yeah, that inflexibility, those really high expectations. And sometimes there's a cost as well, if you've got to travel and get accommodation or things like that for a meeting, and you've not realized that. Okay. And in the induction process. So you've got started, early days. What do you think gets in the way of thriving in that role? Not getting one, absolutely. Not being there, having no induction, feeling like you can't answer questions, poor induction. I think as well, when an induction isn't tailored for your level of experience, I think when there's a one size fits all. So, for example, your finance trustee doesn't need the same induction as your, lived experience trustee. Actually, we've all got different strengths and weaknesses and what we're bringing to the board. So actually not having something, not getting a briefing on the things where you might be unfamiliar, and not making it an environment where you feel like you can ask for those things. I've got to say, I encourage people to do these things all the time, and they all say, oh, I don't feel like I can do that. I don't feel like I can ask. And I think, there is we have to work on both sides of that problem of building the confidence, addressing the imposter syndrome of those aspiring trustees and those new trustees to say, actually, I am entitled to go in and ask for a proper induction if it is not immediately offered. But also we need to get better at offering them and making sure it's part of the process. Yeah, massive assumption that you already know what you're doing and being isolated. We see that a lot. I'm the only person like me on the board is such a common response. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the evidence around this. So research by Standout CV showed that it takes a job seeker in the UK on average 27 applications to secure an interview. And this is a stat that I often share with those aspiring trustees who are getting really, downhearted about their success, and they've maybe applied for 5 or 10 and they haven't got anywhere. And I remind them that they're still beating the odds, that actually they haven't reached that stage yet. And we sometimes put really unrealistic expectations on ourselves as to, the process. And we sometimes have to take a step back and realize the value, the learning that you get from just participating in processes, that you're not always going to get the first one. And also the downside of getting the first one, we do see aspiring trustees who go for the first role that they get offered and then come to regret it because they didn't do enough due diligence and it's actually not quite as good a fit as they first thought. And just to add to this in terms of the barriers experienced by certain groups, so British citizens from ethnic minority backgrounds on average send 60% more job applications to get a positive response from employers compared to their white counterparts. Now, you think about those stats from Reach at the beginning in terms of trustees, and you realise that that's likely a pattern that is very much replicating itself when it comes to trustee vacancies. There's lots of stats about, how, your name matters, how you present. So if your characteristics are on show, then actually that can be a barrier in itself. And you have to think about how you deal with that. So Reach found that younger people under 35 are less likely to be appointed. If you're 55 to 64, you're 80% more likely to be appointed than the 18 to 34 age group. Candidates' chances of being appointed are in part determined by their ethnicity. So white applicants are almost twice as likely to be appointed as Black and Asian applicants. But then there is a big difference in experience between the different ethnicities. For example, people who identify as Black Caribbean are on average the second most likely group to be appointed. People who identify as Asian Chinese are much more likely to be appointed than Asian Pakistani. And those are the sort of below the surface inequalities that that get replicated. I've done a project recently where we've looked at how at diversifying, we've looked at the results of diversifying our governance, and we've done some research on what does the makeup of it now, and we're seeing the same pattern where the inequalities that exist between groups, because there are complexities. So for example, you do see that groups like somebody who is Asian Indian will generally have better outcomes than somebody who is Asian Pakistani, and there are complex reasons for that, including things like Islamophobia, and that comes out again in these. We see, so there isn't a sort of blanket. There are nuances and undertones to these, but that shouldn't be used as a reason to say that those inequalities don't exist and that we're not seeing the outcomes of them. So a little bit as well on barriers to participation. So we had one of our participants shared another blog from Getting on Board, Rebecca. When I joined, I was a part-time disabled student. I had to spend £5 to get the bus to the meeting, and at the time that was a lot. I would look at the sandwiches left at the end of the meeting and think they would have sorted me out for the week. Expenses is a big thing. It means it can be really quite a different experience for different people. I remember when I first joined the board, and one of the other board members was almost kind of, they just kind of, they were having a conversation about basically going, oh, well, I've got a company credit card, so I never bother claiming anything because I'm not paying. And it sort of just set that tone for a culture of a board where it was almost as if it was expected that you didn't claim them. And for a long time, I didn't either, and I really ummed and ahed about it. And it was I don't think we always think about how those things that we say might be perceived by other people when when you're around the board table, because they don't always see the differences. Another quote I've taken, so a study by Yale psychologist Victoria Breskel found that when male executives spoke more often, they were perceived to be more competent. But when female executives spoke more often, they were given lower competence ratings. So actually, we've got to recognize that, and we talk about this in terms of, often when there are inequalities, people are asked to behave like the dominant group. But the reality is they don't get the same reception. If I were to behave in the same way as a white man, the world isn't going to receive that in the same way that if he behaved the same way, right? So he might be regarded as assertive, I might be regarded as aggressive. So we see that, and we've got to think about finding solutions for us that work for us, and I think that's sometimes, what we can find when you are looking for support from people who aren't necessarily, don't necessarily encounter the same barriers. Actually, one of the challenges is that the solutions that work for them don't work for everyone. Okay, so moving on to talking about navigating these solutions. So are you going through, over, or around? And again, this is me talking about reflecting on actually what's your mechanism to get through. And that is something that evolves because sometimes we have our own coping mechanisms. I am somebody who mispronounced her own name for the entirety of school and a big part of my career because it made other people feel comfortable. That's not something I choose to do anymore. You can choose to do the more assimilatory things. Sometimes you go, well, actually, if I'm in a situation where my difference is a barrier for me, you choose to minimize it, and sometimes you choose to live in it, and sometimes it's about, you can be in situations where you feel safe enough to challenge that, and sometimes you don't, and so there isn't a one size fits all. And there is a big part of choosing environments that work for you. And one of the examples I use is related to some of the stats I shared earlier. It shows that if you have a non-sort of westernized name, the impact that will have on your success is huge. I think the stat is that you have to make 9 times as many applications to get the same results. As somebody who is married to someone with a very, very, very Scottish name, I could choose to use my married name, and I don't, because there's the choice between, do I use my married name, and actually maybe I would get through the door more often, but actually there's a reflection for me on, do I want through the door? If they would have weeded me out anyway, it's probably not a safe environment for me, and it's probably not somewhere I want to go. So I'm going to stick to my normal name, and I'm going to let myself get weeded out, because if that's the environment, I don't want to be in it. But equally, we all use the coping mechanisms that work for us at the time. And, you've got to think about where you are on your journey and what works for you. So, question, get you all moving again. If you noticed barriers in the recruitment process before you applied, what would you do? Would not apply. Thank you. That's really interesting. And for those of you who said, oh, I'm attending because I don't experience barriers and I wanted to learn about it, I think this is a really interesting to look at in terms of seeing what this does to your potential talent pool. Actually, if you haven't designed an inclusive recruitment process, you're seeing actually the majority of people would rule themselves out on the first hurdle. Okay. If you notice the barriers in the recruitment process after you had applied, what would you do? So if they were being inflexible with the interview, if something was going wrong, would you try a bit harder if you'd got to that stage, or would you pull out? Okay, so the balance shifts quite a bit because you've invested some time already, and actually you're a bit more reluctant to let that go to waste. But quite a few people saying would ask for the adjustments and would withdraw if I didn't get them. Okay. So what kind of adjustments to the process might you ask for? So bearing in mind all of those barriers that we talked about before, what do you think you could ask for that would make the process more accessible to you? Yep, online interview. Time to prepare, alternative format. What about getting them to book your tickets instead of booking them yourself? Saying, actually, can you put it on the company credit card and send me my ticket? Send me my hotel booking. Yep, informal chat with people involved. Additional time. Interview questions in advance is a great one. Yep. Time to talk to someone about it. Yep. Get a little bit of extra insight. Yep, definitely. Giving questions in advance is incredibly helpful. Clarity in the format. Okay. So my advice to you, research the organization really well. Do your due diligence. Make sure that you're going for organizations that have a shared purpose and shared set of values, and ask those tough questions. Ask them, what's your culture like? What are your values? How do you live them? So ask the tough questions, because it's not just about them interviewing you, it's about you interviewing them. And be open and honest about what you need. And if they decline, then take that as the sign it needs to be. So ask for help and support. Don't do it alone. There are lots of resources out there. We've talked about so many of them over the course of the festival, and we've shared loads of links. So do have a look. This is not something that you need to pay for, and we adamantly say that getting on board. There's lots of free stuff you can do, as well as the bits and pieces you can pay for. And build connections that help you navigate the process. Don't just look for the people who are further ahead in the process and can help you, but also look for peers who are going through the process at the same time. Because the reality is, going to someone who is an experienced trustee is great, and they can give you lots of insight, but they don't necessarily, it's maybe been a long time since they've applied for that. And it is incredibly helpful to have not just that senior support, but also that peer support, and have people who are going through it with you. And can give you that support and encouragement and share opportunities with you along the way. So all things to do. And I've added a quote from Maya Angelou that I'm sure everyone will be familiar with. When people show you who they are, believe them. So if an organization is not very accommodating, if it's not very helpful, sometimes that is a sign that it is an organization that is struggling to live its values and struggling with its culture. And sometimes it's okay to take that as a sign that maybe it's not the right opportunity for you. And be okay with that. I think this can be, it can be tough. There's lots of charities that are struggling for all sorts of reasons at the moment. And sometimes this just isn't a priority for them. And if it is a priority for you, then you are absolutely well within your rights to prioritize that and to go for something that's a better fit for you. So this is a diagram of a kind of maturity curve of organizations in terms of where they are in their equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And it's worth considering where an organization might be on that curve, and also where your own comfort levels are in terms of how many barriers you might have to navigate. Some of us like that challenge, and some of us want to go in and do the work and be their new trustee who's leading on EDI. And some of us want to go into an environment that's already comfortable and inclusive. So it's worth reflecting on your comfort level and their place on that journey. And on that note, what's your comfort level? What level of organization are you willing to work with? Okay. So again, we see, in terms of the barrier, most people are towards the top end of that spectrum. So I think, again, reflecting on more ourselves as organizations, we need to think about how many people we lock out of the process by not prioritizing these issues, by not becoming more inclusive organizations. It really does absolutely limit the talent pool that you have access to. Okay. And I want to talk a bit about what can you do to throw the ladder back down and make sure that the people who come next don't necessarily have to weave their way through as many barriers as you did. So once you're in the door, build a better organization. Advocate for change, highlight the barriers that you've seen, and advocate for solutions. Build consensus around these things and make that space for those conversations and that reflection on how you can be a better organization. Highlight the barriers, invite others to do the same. Make it a normalized conversation, that it's okay to identify where we can do better without it feeling like an attack on the people in the room. And that can be quite a culture change. I appreciate I'm saying that like it's something really simple, and I do really appreciate that it's not. Sometimes when organizations aren't used to having those self-reflective conversations, when they're not used to doing that work, it can be incredibly challenging. But it is worth building those cultures where those conversations can happen, and set goals and make plans to achieve them. Get involved in the future recruitment. This is one of the really critical processes. So review the role profiles, try and make them more open, review the policies, things like travel expenses, meeting venues. How can you make those things more accessible? Review the recruitment process, and also do your own tapping on the shoulder. Right? If you're still in an organization where people do get tapped on the shoulder a lot, maybe try and tap a different kind of person on the shoulder and invite them in. And hopefully you can work towards a more diverse organization. Okay, that's all from me. And now it's over to your questions, which you're welcome to pop in the chat or to ask me through the Menti whatever you are most comfortable with. I'm going to take a quick look and see. I don't seem to ever get shortlisted. Help. Okay. I think there are lots of things, lots of reasons that can be. And it is, it's what we talked about. Actually, I think there's a little bit of an unwritten code on how these applications are. So I would strongly advise getting along to one of Leon's sessions on how to be, what's a trustee and how do I become one, and finding out a bit more. And also have a look at the templates online that share a bit more. There's lots of CV templates getting on boards. What got one, so does dynamic boards, and different organizations. There's lots of templates online. So look for the ones that are specifically for trustees, or non-executives is the other term that gets used, which is basically just a corporate trustee. And that can give you a bit more insight in what you can do to, I guess, help you along the way. So I can see I guess there's a question, there seems to be a bit of a discussion about actually what do the 92% be on board? And it's a question that has come up in some of our CBLP cohorts before, where some of the people who are participating say, do you know what, actually I am a white middle-aged middle-class man, should I really be here learning how to be a trustee? And one of the things we often say in that is, actually, as long as you're there to be an advocate for change, yes, absolutely. If you're going to go in there and throw the ladder back down, the reality is that people who are part of that larger group, there's going to be rooms that you can get into that I can't, quite simply. And actually, in order for that to happen, you need to, for those boards to change, we need advocates in there, and they need to look like all sorts of people, including the majority groups. I find the cover letter really daunting, how best to approach it. So I think this can be a bit of a tricky question because it can be different depending on what you're applying to. So for example, if you've got organizations that are either public sector or very closely linked to the public sector, so things like NESA that are like, they were originally publicly funded, but they've become charities, they tend to still operate in that very public sector approach where they really want you to address every single criteria on the list. But in a typical charity one, usually what I do is group the criteria into sort of 3 elements that I'm strongest in, and I will focus on those, and I'll bring in the case studies around those so that it is a bit more accessible. Generally, when it comes to charitable organizations, a lot of people looking at it are very short on time. So I do my best to try and keep it quite short, quite accessible, and to the point. So I don't necessarily hit on every single criteria, but I hit on the ones that I'm strongest at, to keep it a bit more focused. How do you maintain your motivation when you receive disappointments? Because your face doesn't fit. I think that's a really important one. I think I've got to say, I had a very mixed reaction to learning about some of the statistics about how much harder it is, because I think on the one hand, it is incredibly disheartening to know that you're going to have to try that much harder and for there to be evidence behind those things that you've always kind of known. But equally, I also think it encourages us all to be a bit kinder to ourselves. And, I do have conversations when I'm doing coaching, things like that, about actually, we've got to have a realistic bar for what counts as good. And we've got to be kind to ourselves that we are still meeting it. I think sometimes, and also I think sometimes I've got to that place where I think that if my face doesn't fit, then it's not necessarily an environment that I want to be in. And sometimes I'm just grateful that I didn't go down a rabbit hole I didn't want, that I wouldn't have felt particularly comfortable in. And it is important. I think I spend a lot more time now making sure that I find the right opportunity and not just an opportunity. And I get that that's a bit easier to say when you're a bit further on in the journey. But yeah, I do. I would take heart that it's worth it. Yeah, age it can be a barrier, and I'm not sure what end of the spectrum you're on. But yeah, absolutely, and you can't change it. And it's one of those things that, like I say, it can be a barrier whether you are at the beginning of your career or towards the later stages of it. And it's not something you change. And I guess again, I would say you've got to think about, there are lots of things that say take all the dates off your CV. And the reality is nobody can do anything about it. And that is one tactic. You can anonymize it, and people do see real improvements in their success and improvements, not just when it comes to getting roles, but also in the kind of remuneration they're offered, if they are more discreet about those factors. But that doesn't stop the fact that eventually you're still going to have to meet somebody face to face, and they're going to realize. And so it can be really tough. But I think I do think that sometimes it's less of a barrier in this sector than perhaps in a professional role. And when you find the right organization, when they're focused around something that you care about, you can make your way into it. How do we get organizations to take diversity and inclusion seriously, and how do we get to do it without aggravating them? I'm a big advocate for the fact that I think we can't force organizations that aren't ready. And sometimes you are just in the stage of shifting the balance, and that's where those advocates become, building consensus around the role around the board about the need for something. I can think of one board that I've been on, and when I first joined the board in the first couple of years, there was quite a lot of what felt like the old guard. And the reality was their priorities were quite different. And actually, it was a couple of years in before we really, really got to make any big moves on this, because some of that, because there was some turnover and some shift. I remember actually attending a session sometime last year, and someone was saying, the reality is to really, really transform a board, you need 6 years. Because actually, when you're talking about terms, when you're talking about how a board moves, you might only meet each other 4 times in a year. And so it can take a long time to get to that place. And yeah, I think if you're getting an aggressive response, you're talking to a board that's not ready. And then you've got to make decisions about whether you're willing to wait it out until the balance shifts, until you can make more of an impact. Yeah, Kevin, they probably won't. Where can charities advertise roles that remove barriers? As openly as possible in as many places as possible is what I would say. I think that came up in one of the earlier sessions today, is actually it's worth using multiple channels. If you really want a diverse group of people to respond, you need to put it in places that different types of people will see it. So be virtual and non-virtual, use LinkedIn, use Reach, use your own website so that you're hitting your own community as well. But also make sure you're getting onto platforms, and you can use specialist platforms or reach out to some of the organizations in the sector. So the Young Trustees Movement, Queer Trustees, Action for Trustee Racial Diversity, and they can get it into their communities so that you are reaching through to those groups that maybe you don't have the connections to, but they do. What are the barriers to getting a trustee role that I might be putting up myself? I think we do lots of things to ourselves. I think it's really it's an important thing to reflect on. And I think one of the biggest barriers is not asking for help, because we don't want to admit that we need it. We don't want to admit that the barrier exists, and that's a bit of a uncomfortable realization and topic that or we want to pretend like we are just like everyone else, and we want to things like, I don't want to ask them to book my ticket for me because I don't want them to know that that's a financial that there's a financial barrier for me, or I don't want to ask them to move the interview because I don't want them to know about my childcare responsibilities or my caring responsibilities. So I'm just going to bend over backwards to get someone else to come in and do that for me. And I think that is the way in which we really create barriers for ourselves, by trying to act as if we don't have to face those barriers, and wanting to hide that they are part of our lives. From a charity's perspective, what should they do to minimize barriers? I think it really does require a bit of a bespoke exercise because the barriers in different organizations are different. So I do a lot of work with membership organizations. Some of them have a voting process enshrined into their founding documents, and some of them have complete freedom to do what they want. And so it can be really particular, how you've learned to do things will have come up from from your very particular existence, and it can be very different depending on the charity. But I do think we should all spend some time reflecting on the process that we have, what barriers are being put up at the different stages of the process, and what we can do to remove them. And I think that involves a really conscious exercise. I think it's worth getting people involved with the lived experience that can actually help you in that process, to sort of unpick, because we all know that we don't always see the barrier if we haven't experienced it. We don't always recognize the things that other people face when it's not within our orbit, and that's not us being deliberately malicious. That's just us being a bit thoughtless because it's not something that would occur to us. How long after the deadline should you wait before asking for feedback on your application if you've not been contacted? Again, I think there's a little bit of it depends on this one, because I would say that most interviews now, they'll tell you at the end sort of when they expect to let you know by. And I'd probably give it a week after that point before I got back in touch and said, okay, I think I might not have been successful here. If there's any feedback you can share. What are the rules, best practice around appointing a person who has the required skills for a trustee position but has a criminal record? There isn't a bar to hiring someone with a criminal record. It might be that if they're in a safeguarding position or in a organization with safeguarding that faces safeguarding issues that are dealing with vulnerable groups, they might not pass the kind of enhanced disclosure checks and things like that, depending on the nature of their record. But there aren't any particular rules that prohibit it unless there's a specific issue. And there will be many organizations where actually that's a brilliant sort of asset. For example, I can think of, there is a community interest company up here in Scotland, and what they do is they distribute vegetable boxes, and pretty much all of their employees are people with who have a criminal record. So it is a company that is specifically set up with the purpose of rehabilitating and getting people back into society, and they go around delivering veg boxes. And I would imagine in that type of scenario it would be an absolute asset to have somebody on the board with that kind of lived experience, to talk about, to uncover the barriers that they face. Absolutely, there are lots of networks that you can join. So I think I've mentioned a few of them already. So there's Queer Trustees, there's Action for Trustee Racial Diversity, there is Young Trustee Movement, there's Women on Boards, there are lots of if you're looking for people who are facing similar barriers, there are lots of groups that you can join to try and meet people like you. There are also things like groups on LinkedIn and things like that. So not all of them are completely formal. Some of them there are different degrees of formality, and I would absolutely recommend joining them and getting in touch with people who are going through the same journey, because that's where you're going to find the best sort of resources on how to navigate it. And a big part of navigating it is navigating it together. Okay. So, is there any evidence to show that staff charities have different challenges for recruiting trustees compared to the paid workforce, or are these barriers reflected in both aspects? And should this be discussed jointly with SMT? So, I'd say there's a lot more evidence for employees than there is for trustees, but the evidence that is emerging around trustees shows that the outcomes are fairly similar and that a lot of the barriers are similar. I think there are some unique challenges in that, particularly with trustees generally being unpaid. So the financial barriers can exacerbate it more. And I do think that, a lot of the aspects of good board recruitment are very similar to, in terms of how you run a recruitment process. It might be your starting point might be a little bit different, sort of, an org design process versus a board skills audit is a little bit different, but actually in terms of the recruitment process itself, it's incredibly similar. So I think when if that's what you're discussing the sort of recruitment process, absolutely it can be dealt with together. And I think a lot of the changes that you can make should be read across. Okay, and I think with 3 minutes to go, we might have addressed the questions, and that leaves Leon just enough time for the wrap up.
Thanks, Satna, and thank you everybody for attending. We're just going to stop the recording in a second, because that's the end of this session. Now, as I said at the start, there is networking session that happens straight after this. So if you want to stay for that, you can do. And as usual, I'm just about to place into the chat function the evaluation form that we have for you all to fill out. The other thing to say is that we have still a full program of activities going on tomorrow and on Friday, so we've got 2 days left. And tomorrow we have fundraising faux pas, things trustees have done to mess up getting the money. We've got lived experience on boards, the latest insights. Then at 5 o'clock, we've got should boards have diversity quotas? And then at 6:30, we have from frontline volunteer to trustee. And then straight after that is another networking session that we have. So make sure that you come along to those if you haven't done. If you've got a weekly pass, then you're able to come to all of those included in your current pass rate. We are still selling weekly passes. So if you're thinking, I've been to 1 or 2 sessions, I've loved them, I want to come to a couple more, you can get a weekly pass, and there is a slight discount code that I've just popped into the chat function for you there as well. Otherwise, if you've got everything you need from the links in the chat function, feel free to drop off when you're ready. And if you're staying for networking, then we will change the session in just a moment, but just stay where you are. Go and grab a cup of tea,